Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our study in the book of Nehemiah. It's an exciting day because we're finishing up this great book today. We are in chapter 13, and the PDF that you're seeing up on the screen, you can download, and now you can download all 13 chapters for the whole book of Nehemiah if you would like on our website at tobelikechrist.com. And do watch out for the physical book coming to Amazon eventually. I'm going to have Nehemiah and Ezra together in one volume. I am still debating whether or not I'm going to put Esther into that same book or if Esther is going to be its own thing. We're going to do Esther next. But all that can be decided later. Let's go ahead and talk about this final chapter because there's quite a bit to cover here. So we've actually added a new date to our timeline. It's been somewhat static for most of the book, but you'll see at the bottom there in 433 BC, about 11 years after he arrived in Jerusalem, Nehemiah returns to Persia to visit the king Artaxerxes. So we're going to talk about some of that today. Okay, our key characters, we have Nehemiah. He was the former cupbearer to the king of Persia before he went to Jerusalem and helped the people to reform some things that they had wrong and also to rebuild the walls of the city. We have Artaxerxes Longimanus, who is this Persian king. He reigned from 464 to about 424 BC. We have Tobiah. Now, you may have forgotten who he is. Maybe if I say Sanballat and Tobiah, your memory might be jogged a little bit. We haven't talked about him in a couple chapters. He's one of the enemies of Nehemiah, and he was one of those who, along with Sanballat, wanted to keep the city of Jerusalem from being rebuilt. And we also have one of Tobiah's friends who was working in the capacity of a priest, and that is Eliashib. More on him in the outline. And for our map today, we're kind of returning to similar locations as to what we saw in chapter 1. We have, of course, Jerusalem, where Nehemiah has been, but we're also going to talk about Nehemiah returning to King Artaxerxes. We're not exactly told where he was when he visited him in Persia. A likely guess, I think, would be Susa, the capital of the kingdom, which was where Artaxerxes was in Nehemiah chapter 1, when Nehemiah initially departed from the king. As we take a look at our outline, you will notice that we have 5 sections today, and maybe the best way to think about this chapter is just a summary of the reforms and the work that Nehemiah did in Judah. We know that he built the walls, but he also did many other things, along with Ezra, the scribe and priest. So let's go over these one by one. Verses 1 through 3, separating themselves from the other nations. When the Jews read from the book of the law of God, they read that they were not to intermix with the idolatrous nations that surrounded them, specifically the Ammonites and the Moabites. So after learning this, they separated themselves from the foreigners and their influence. So that's reform number 1. In verses 4 through 9, we see number 2. Nehemiah evicts Tobiah from the temple grounds. So Eliashib, who was one of the priests, was friends with Tobiah, this guy who was the constant enemy of Nehemiah. When Nehemiah left Jerusalem to go back to Persia to visit the king, Eliashib did something he shouldn't have. He emptied one of the chambers that was meant to house the provisions for the Levites, and he furnished it for Tobiah, seemingly like when Tobiah came to Jerusalem, he would have a place to stay. Well, upon his return, Nehemiah was furious about this. Tobiah had no business in the city. He was an enemy of the Jews, and so Nehemiah threw all the furniture out of the chamber, and he returned the space to its original use. Reform number 3 is in verses 10 through 14, neglect of the Levites. Nehemiah also discovered that upon his return, the Levites weren't receiving what was due to them from the tithes of the people of Judah. And he confronted the leaders about this, and he made a reform. The Jews brought their tithes to the temple, and Nehemiah appointed trustworthy men to distribute what was collected. Reform number 4 is in verses 15 through 22, no respect for the Sabbath day. So the Sabbath day was a sacred day, and the Jews weren't supposed to work on that day. It was supposed to be a day of rest. But Nehemiah noticed that the Sabbath was being treated like it was any ordinary day. People were working as usual, and merchants were coming in and out of the city selling their wares. Nehemiah warned the Jews that God was potentially going to get really angry about this, and they could be punished like their forefathers for making the same mistakes. So he ordered them to honor the Sabbath, and he directed the gates of Jerusalem to be closed on the Sabbath and not reopened until the Sabbath was over. And that brings us to section number 5, last reform, marriages to foreign women. We saw this one during the days of Ezra as well, verses 23 through 31. Nehemiah confronted his countrymen who had married foreign women. This was forbidden in the law of God because of their corrupting influence. Nehemiah reminded his countrymen of King Solomon, who had gotten himself into spiritual trouble after marrying dozens of foreign women who honored foreign gods. Nehemiah considered these foreign unions a desecration and a treacherous act against God, especially when God's priests were involved. So now let's go down to the bottom of our last outline of Nehemiah and talk about an application. Sometimes striving for holiness means that you're going to be perceived as the mean guy or the mean lady. Do you think that Nehemiah made some enemies during his reforms when he was demanding that the people do all of these things? There were probably people who talked bad about Nehemiah because he shut down their shop on the Sabbath days or Saturdays. There were probably people who thought that he needed to just mind his own business, that he was too nosy. There were probably people who accused him of being domineering, like abusing his leadership power. And there were probably people who thought that he had kind of a holier-than-thou attitude. I'm sure that he was gossiped about, and I'm sure he lost some friends during his reforms. But these were some of the consequences that he accepted because he was determined to take his role as a leader seriously. A leader who is serious about holiness won't always be the, quote, nice guy. When we are looking to appoint leaders over our congregations, we should be looking for men who are going to lead us to greater holiness. We don't want a bunch of nice guy leaders who avoid conflict at all cost, even when sin is corrupting our Christian communities. The devil will run over nice guy leaders, and I think we've seen a lot of that in a lot of modern churches. Of course, we need men who are striving for peace, and that's their goal, but who are equally ready to be slandered and gossiped about and hated if that's what it takes to preserve the holiness of God's church. What we've seen in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and I think this is one of the great takeaway lessons from these books, is we see what God-empowered leadership is supposed to look like. So there you have it. That is the book of Nehemiah. Thanks everybody for studying with me. I've really enjoyed it. And Lord willing, we're talking about Esther, which is just a great book. It's another book kind of like Joseph's story that could just so easily be made into a movie. Esther's story is a lot like that. And so we'll begin discovering that, Lord willing, tomorrow as we take on Esther 1.